I've spoken to coastal communities in a lot of different places, and they said their ancestors, before the era of colonization, their ancestors used to live up in the hills on these islands because they knew the coast was a really dangerous place, because big waves, because you didn't have shelter, and so on and so on. Um, and a lot of people are saying, well, we should just have stayed there because our ancestors knew it was safe to live up in the hills. And it was only when these wretched Europeans came along and colonized the place, and it was only when the missionaries came along and said, "Come on, everyone, come down to the coast, so we can control you better." We should have resisted, they're saying, because we knew the coast was a dangerous place. And I think that's a really important lesson, is that Pacific Island peoples, having lived on islands in the center of the Pacific for more than 3 millennia, they understood that the coastline was not the safest place to live. But colonization turned all this around, and people moved to the coasts. And now, of course, they find themselves in strife, which might not have been necessary if they were still living up on the hills.
Long before satellites and tide gauges existed, Pacific Island communities have been recording environmental change through stories, songs, and memories. But today, as sea levels rise, the world is realizing something important. The most powerful climate knowledge has been with us all along, waiting to be listened to. Hello, listeners, and welcome to H2O and Beyond. My name is Alex Han, and each week we dive into the science, systems, and stories behind the water we use every day. In today's episode, I'm joined by Dr. Patrick Nunn, who is a professor of geology at the University of the Sunshine Coast in Australia. Welcome to the podcast, Professor Nunn. It's great to have you on the show.
Many thanks, Alex. It's an honor to be with you today.
So something I like to ask my guests before we get started is if they could, give us a little introduction about who you are, what you do, and the place you work at.
Well, I have worked in the Pacific Islands for more than 35 years now. And when I first went there, as a geologist, I was very interested in going everywhere where there was interesting geology. So I used to go to a lot of sort of outer islands where hardly anyone spoke very much English. And so I had to learn quite a lot of the local languages. And even today I speak fluent Fijian. And this really helps me, I suppose, get beneath the surface of a culture in a way that I never expected when I was younger that I would be able to do. And that, in a way, has opened up a whole new world for me. I realized that people like myself and yourself who learn and are educated through reading and writing, other people are educated in similar ways, but using quite different methods. Mm-hmm. So I suppose it's given me an appreciation of cultural diversity that I never really expected to get. And so that's my journey. I live in Australia now, but I still go back to the Pacific several times a year and carry on with the research that I've been doing.
Yeah, and did you grow up in Australia, like learning about these things, or?
No, I didn't. I grew up in the UK, in Northwest Europe, and I learned a lot about ancient stories. One of my grandmothers was Scottish, and she used to tell me all sorts of myths and legends about ancient Scotland, and stories of giants and mermaids and all sorts of other things, which I suppose piqued my interest in this kind of thing. But no, after I finished my doctorate, I couldn't get a job in the UK because there were no jobs, so I went out to the Pacific Islands, and I thought I'd stay there for 3 years and go back to the UK, but I ended up staying for 25 years and then moved to Australia, which is much closer, of course. So.
And right now you're at the, the University of the Sunshine Coast. Is that like on the east side of Australia? I mean, like for us Americans, I don't think a lot of us know much about Australia.
Do you know, Alex, Australia is the same size as the conterminous United States. If you fly from Perth in Western Australia to Brisbane in the east of Australia, it's the same as going from Los Angeles to New York. So it's the same kind of size. And it's an incredible place. I mean, it's got a tiny population relative to the land area. And it's got several good universities. I work at one of the smaller ones because it suits me in many ways. And they've been very welcoming to me. So, yes, the University of the Sunshine Coast. It's about 1 hour's drive north of Brisbane on the east coast of Australia. And it was called the Sunshine Coast long before the university was established here. It's a very nice place. Lots of students, lots of international students. We get loads of students coming from Europe because of the surfing. The surfing apparently is some of the best surfing anywhere in the world, but I'm not the person to talk to about.
Great. Thank you for that. And, before we start, I want to give our listeners some context. And, the topic of today's episode is traditional knowledge and Pacific Island communities and, other communities that have this traditional knowledge. So to start off, who are these, Pacific Islanders and how long have they been living on these islands for?
Let me just take a step back, Alex, because you've asked a really good question. But our ancestors only learned to read and write, 150, 200 years ago? I know there was reading and writing around before that. But before that time, our ancestors survived by communicating knowledge orally, by word of mouth. And that's, I think, you don't find that surviving in many parts of the world. But the Pacific is one place where you do. People reached the Pacific Islands around about 3,200 years ago. They sailed from the west coast or the western seaboard of the Pacific, places like Papua New Guinea and the Philippines and China, Japan. They sailed west over the east. Sorry, they sailed east over the eastern horizon from there and found islands that were uninhabited by people. And there's some extraordinary stories there. But I think the main point to take out of that is that they were the greatest navigators of their time, 3,500 years ago. There are some voyages that took place that were more than I only think in kilometers, but more than 2,300 kilometers that were taking place 3,500 years ago. 2,300 kilometers of open water. There was no one anywhere else in the world at that time who was capable of crossing such vast distances of ocean. So their achievements were quite extraordinary for the time. But they reached Pacific Islands and they colonized one group of islands after another. And they actually reached the west coast of the Americas long before Europeans knew that the Pacific existed. So they reached South America in Chile, they reached Central America in Panama, and they reached California. They reached the Chumash people in California. So people who have studied Chumash anthropology have found words from the Pacific Islands there and techniques of canoe making and things like that were introduced by Pacific Island peoples, probably about 1,000 years ago. We don't know. So Pacific Islanders, crossed 16,000 kilometers of ocean from the west to the east, more than, certainly more than 1,000 years ago. It was an extraordinary achievement.
I see. And, is the language that all of these Pacific Islanders speak, is it like one language family? I think I remember like in a class a few years ago, it was like Austronesian or Polynesian. I forgot. I get them mixed up. Is it that language family?
Yeah, that's it. Austronesian. Yeah, it's the Austronesian language family. And actually, when you know one Pacific Island language, it's quite easy to learn the next Pacific Island language because letters may change, but the ways in which they're combined to describe certain things doesn't change, and the structure of sentences doesn't change. So, yes, absolutely. The famous one is Hale for a house in Hawaiian, which is the same as it is in, no, it's not the same. In Samoa and Tonga, it's Fale, and in Fijian, it's Vale. But it's Vale, Fale, Hale. It's the same word, essentially, just with one or two letters changed at the most. So yeah, absolutely.
And, just curious, are the native people of Hawaii considered Pacific Islanders?
Oh yes, indeed, absolutely. Just like the native people of New Zealand are. Yeah,
Uh,
they are all part of the same diaspora, and we have been able to trace the actual routes that they took, from one island to another. Um, largely by radiocarbon dating of the things they left behind. Yeah.
wow. And, when people hear about traditional knowledge, they often think of, myths or folklore. How would you define it in the context of environmental science?
Look, I have to confess to having been converted. When I was your age, or when I guess I was your age, I probably did think of myths and legends as things that were invented, as cultural inventions. And but as I've got more experience, I've started to realize that myths and legends are not generally mythical or legendary. They are actually people's memories of events that actually happened, and they have become encoded through the mindsets of the time into things that today we call myths and legends, because it's so difficult to unpack them and to explain them. But when you do that, it's quite clear what they're referring to. Can I give you an example from North America? Okay, so I'm sure many of your listeners have been to Crater Lake in Oregon, and Crater Lake used to be a huge volcano that geologists today call Mount Mazama, and it blew itself up about 7,600 years ago. And Mount Mazama collapsed into the old magma chamber in the ground, and gradually that filled up with water to make Crater Lake as we see it today. And that event 7,600 years ago was recorded in Klamath Native American oral traditions when Europeans first got to that area in the 1840s, 1850s. So people of that area, the native people of that area, had recorded those life-changing events. The explosion and collapse of a massive volcano and the creation of Crater Lake. They'd recorded that in their oral traditions and passed that story down through time to reach us today. And that's not an isolated example, but it's a nice example.
I see. And, what's an example that, the Pacific Islanders like to use?
Okay, well, I had a PhD student a few years ago, Loredana Lancini, and she was an expert in oral traditions. And she and I went to the southern islands of Kondavu in Fiji. And at the western end of the main island in the Kondavu Island group in Fiji, there is a volcano, and it's called Nambukaluvu, which means the giant yam mound. And that volcano erupted last about 2,500 years ago. And Loredana and I went to about 13 different communities of people all the way around the island of Kondavu. And from each of those communities, we got a different story about the volcanic eruption that took place 2,500 years ago. Typically stories about one god getting angry with another god and the two fighting each other and a volcanic eruption occurring as a result, and ash being carried across the island and dropped in different places to create different landforms, and giant footprints, and gods hiding under the sea and the sea being drunk by the other god. All of these things that you can relate to what likely happened during that volcanic eruption, which was not just an eruption of the volcano, but the spread of ash across the landscape, and tsunamis that caused the sea to withdraw and then to come up again. All of these things perfectly recollected in these stories and preserved in oral traditions for 2,500 years, at least in that location. So that's one example there. And I've formed the view that people remembered these kinds of stories as a form of risk management. So today, wherever we live in the world, we understand something about the risks of living in a particular place. Do we get earthquakes? Do we get floods? Do we get volcanoes erupting? Are there severe storms likely to happen at different times of the year? What do we do to survive these things? And I think that before writing and reading came along, oral societies used very similar methods to minimize their exposure to risk. And part of that was learning the stories about what had happened in the past and what therefore might happen again in the future, like the story of the volcanic eruption at Nambucalevu in Fiji.
So, these stories, they're actually based on real events that happened in the past, and these communities can actually use like these stories that have been passed down through generations to help, sort of protect themselves and future generations, right? Is that how they use them?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, yes. And that's been a revelation for me, but wherever I look now in the world, I see something similar. This is why the Klamath people in Oregon, that's why they preserve the story of the eruption of Mount Mazama to form Crater Lake for 7,600 years. Because if something like that happened again, they wanted to know what the precursors were, what the signs were that it was going to happen, okay, and what to do to survive it. So they had these stories, and these stories were very important. They weren't just stories, they weren't just invented. They were things, they were practical advice to people about how to survive these events.
I see. And, besides volcanic eruptions, what other types of environmental change have been recorded through these stories?
A lot of people today talk about the Pacific Islands as being on the front line of climate change, which, I don't totally agree with that, but a lot of Pacific Islands are experiencing the effects of climate change, particularly rising sea levels along the coasts of these islands, much sooner than it's going to be experienced in other parts of the world. The average rate of global sea level rise at the moment is around 3.5 millimeters every year. And in some parts of the Western Pacific, sea level is rising at around 12 millimeters every year. So most people in the Pacific live along the coastline. So when you get rises of sea level like that, year upon year upon year, it's causing great disruption. And people, in many cases, are leaning on their traditional knowledge to know what to do. So they are planting different types of trees and grasses and creepers along the coast, which is what their ancestors did. They're very spiritual people in the Pacific. They do a lot of praying. And there's a lot of, I suppose, what you would call supplication, of asking gods, both sort of contemporary gods and past gods, to intervene and to stop this kind of thing from happening. But I think the best example is that a lot of people are moving away from the coasts. And I've spoken to coastal communities in a lot of different places, and they said their ancestors, before the era of colonization, their ancestors used to live up in the hills on these islands because they knew the coast was a really dangerous place, because big waves, because you didn't have shelter, and so on and so on. And a lot of people are saying, well, we should just have stayed there because our ancestors knew it was safe to live up in the hills. And it was only when these wretched Europeans came along and colonized the place, and it was only when the missionaries came along and said, come on, everyone, come down to the coast so we can control you better. We should have resisted, they're saying, because we knew the coast was a dangerous place. And I think that's a really important lesson, is that Pacific Island peoples, having lived on islands in the center of the Pacific for more than 3 millennia, they understood that the coastline was not the safest place to live. But colonization turned all this around, and people moved to the coasts. And now, of course, they find themselves in strife which might not have been necessary if they were still living up on the hills.
I actually didn't realize that you mentioned that in the past sea levels have risen, because I thought this was like a really recent thing. What exactly did the traditional knowledge about rising sea levels tell us?
No, I've misled you. I'm sorry, Alex. Sea levels have gone up and down in the
Hmm.
past, but the present era of sea level rise is quite different, in terms of how long it's been going on and how much faster it is than in the past. But yes, certainly sea levels did go up and down in the last 3,000 years in the Pacific, and people adapted to that. But people also adapted to the periodic impact of giant waves. So if you're on an island in the middle of the Pacific, and if there's an earthquake in Chile or in Alaska, that can send tsunami waves across the Pacific. And as they get close to your island, they can come up to 10, 12 meters in height and smash into the coasts of the island. So people knew about these kinds of events. And that's one reason why they lived inland, because they were safer from those kinds of events. And their ancestors knew this. But all of that kind of traditional knowledge got swept away as the island countries were colonized, and other people basically sort of took control.
It's not so easy for them, like right now, to just, pack up their things and move back up to the mountains, right? It's not that simple.
No, it's not that simple, because again, what's happened with colonization is that you suddenly have this novel phenomenon called land ownership, which you never really had before. People could move around much more freely in the pre-colonization past in the Pacific than they can do today. Um, it doesn't always work. I mean, again, I know dozens of coastal communities that are relocating themselves gradually inland. They own the land up the hill, and they're quite happy to move up there. So I don't think we should exaggerate the problems. There's Pacific Island peoples have evolved ways of negotiating these kinds of challenges, and sometimes governments and aid donors are not very helpful in this, because you get outside agencies coming in, and they don't understand Pacific Island cultures and their resilience and their strengths. They just see vulnerability and weakness, and they impose unfamiliar solutions on Pacific Island countries. Um, a good example is money. So, in the past, we've had outside agencies giving millions and millions of dollars to Pacific Island countries to help them cope with climate change. Um, they coped in the past without money. So I think it's a much more sustainable solution is to go back to the times in the past and say, how can we help ourselves? But what, of course, is happening today is that a lot of Pacific Island communities are saying, well, that community got $500,000 to relocate, so we're going to wait until someone gives us $500,000 to relocate. It's not going to be a sustainable long-term solution. So I worry a bit about that kind of thing. I think as a rule, sorry, Alex, I think as a rule, a lot of Pacific Island people today undervalue their traditional knowledge and the traditional solutions that their ancestors evolved. And a lot of the reason for that is because, Western solutions have come in and with lots of money, and people have been trained to think of them as somehow superior, which in most cases, I'm afraid they're not.
And, do you think in a way these Western agencies coming in and helping, they've sort of underestimated the traditional knowledge that these Pacific Islander communities have had for like the last thousands of years?
Oh, yeah. No question about it. Let me give you a good example. One which I came across a few weeks ago. I was in a rural community in Fiji, and the local community was telling me about this group of ecologists, marine ecologists, that had come in and had run 2 or 3 workshops in the community to explain how the ecosystem worked in Western scientific terms. So basically, marine ecology 100 or something like that. And the local people said they never asked us what we knew. They just assumed we knew nothing. And they proceeded on that basis. But they said if they'd asked us, we could have told them everything. We could have told them everything and more that they taught us. They said, oh, here's a shell, here's a crab. This is what they do. This is how they live. And the people said, well, we know all this. Okay, we actually know the names of 55 different types of shell, and we actually have 12 different types of crab, and we can tell you the life histories of each one, but you never bothered to ask us. So I think a lot of damage has been done, and I think a lot of damage continues to be done because people with money, outside agencies with money, come into the Pacific and they wave that money around and say, here's a solution for you. And people who don't have so much money are going to say, yeah, of course, come, tell us about it. Doesn't always work.
Yeah, and there's a saying like money can solve a lot of problems, but it also at the same time can't solve a lot of them. So it's like, what do you even, do you think like they should sort of just how do I say it? Do you think we should just like leave these Pacific Island communities like alone in that case and let them figure things out using their own traditional knowledge? What do you think the best path would be?
It's one way to go.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that should be done deliberately. I think in a way we've moved past that point now. I think there's a lot of communities in the Pacific Islands that don't have the stock of traditional knowledge that their grandparents had. So I think that's a problem. That said, I've also believed that the amount of money that's being given to Pacific Island countries for adapting to climate change is unhelpful. Because if you look at the last 10 years, the amount of money every year upon year upon year has gone up. So Pacific Island countries are increasing their dependency on outside funding for climate change adaptation. And what I predict is that a lot of the donor countries are going to have to find so much money for their own adaptation to climate change in 10 years' time. Okay. How many billions of dollars will it take to build more levees around New Orleans or Galveston or somewhere like that? And it's the same in Australia. All the East Coast cities where most people live are going to need massive protection from rising sea levels. So where's that money going to come from? Well, I bet most of it's going to come from the overseas aid budget. And I know what's happened in the US, but I think that's what's likely to happen in the future with other aid donors. So what I'm telling Pacific Island countries right now is stop this unsustainable dependency on external funding and think about how you can increase your autonomy, how you can help yourselves adapt to climate change, because I think that's the only sustainable way forward. And Alex, if you don't mind me just throwing this in as well, I mean, I've worked with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change now for 2 decades, and I think one of the things that we have concluded is that money is not going to solve the problems of climate change. It's not something we can buy our way out of. It's something that requires every individual living on this planet to change their behavior, whether it's their behavior around consumption or whether it's the behavior about where they choose to live, and so on and so on. I often give public talks here in Australia about climate change. And, I always get someone at the end of the lecture coming up to me, and they say, I've got a house that's worth $5 million and it's sitting there. It's 10 meters from the sea and the sea is eating into the ground. What can I do about this? And I say, look, I'm really sorry, but there's nothing you can do about this. All you can do is to move. And they often get really angry about this, as though I'm the one to blame, because they don't want to move. None of us want to move. But that's the point, I think, is that our ancestors in the past probably didn't want to move either, but they had to. They adapted, and we will have to adapt in the future. And it really doesn't matter how much money we have. What's that going to buy us? So I think the point about money is the point of is part of a global conversation.
Yeah, you can't really buy your way out of reducing our carbon emissions. You actually have to do something about it.
That's it. Exactly.
Mm-hmm. And, going back to how I remember like a few minutes ago, you mentioned that some of these communities have lost some of their, traditional knowledge. Why is that?
I think when you look at the education systems in the Pacific Island, most of those are very much globally focused, Western focused. There's very little about traditional knowledge. Most traditional knowledge and, I suppose, cultural learning is done at home or is done in the community. And if you live outside the community, if you grow up in a town or a city in the Pacific Islands, the chances of you learning much of that knowledge is probably getting less and less every year upon year. So, yeah, it's basically just that Western knowledge has infiltrated the school curriculum, and it's infiltrated the cities. Most Pacific Island cities have a McDonald's or a KFC or something like that. You have to go to the more remote parts of Pacific Island countries to actually find communities where traditional knowledge is intact and is being used and is being trusted. And it's a very interesting one. We were in a community in Fiji earlier this year, and it's called Mandiri, and it's in the Nandronga province. And we were there, and we were just talking about traditional knowledge, and I was asking about the birds, and they were saying, when a storm is coming, we see these birds flying across the land, which they don't normally do. And I said, that's so interesting, We wrote down all the information they were giving us. And as we were leaving that community, one of the older men came up to me and he said, we are so happy that you came to ask us about our traditional knowledge. And if you could spend longer, we could tell you even more. There's not just one bird whose behavior we look at. There's probably around 20 different bird species that do different things. And we can tell the weather or predict the weather from what they're doing. And he said, we're so happy that you came, or you're showing an interest in our traditional knowledge, because he said so many people these days ridicule it. They make fun of it. They say, you're backwards or something like that, because you believe in these things rather than in, Western scientific explanations of things. But again, I think for the future, traditional knowledge is going to be very, very important, because traditional knowledge in places like the Pacific Islands is place-based. Okay, so people grow up in a particular place, they live there for hundreds, if not thousands of years. They learn about the landscape and how it changes. They learn about the seasons and about the weather, about the possibilities of finding water, the possibilities of growing different crops. That's place-based traditional knowledge. And then you get this global scientific knowledge coming in, which is not place-based. It's just generic. And it's not going to tell you anything about a particular place. It's going to say, the temperature is rising like this, or the sea level is rising like this. It's not actually very helpful to people who live in a particular place and whose ancestors have been there for a long time.
Can traditional knowledge from, one island in the Pacific, can that traditional knowledge be applied to people living in the Western world like me and you? Is it useful to us?
Yes. I mean, to some extent. I think it's very important not to romanticize traditional knowledge, wherever that traditional knowledge comes from. But I think the whole business of living sustainably is something which is at the heart of traditional knowledge. So traditional knowledge allowed people to live in a particular place for prolonged periods of time, withstanding various catastrophes, whether it was a storm or a volcanic eruption or something like that. And I think we've lost a lot of that in the West. We've become so focused on consumption and on growth. And these are not necessarily elements of many traditional societies. So I think there is a general lesson that we can learn from them, that they can teach us how to be sustainable, and they can teach us about the importance of sustainability. We need to survive as a species. We're not going to survive if we take a lot more than we can return to the environment. Okay, and the sort of the number of technological fixes we can apply is, of course, limited.
And in the past, why do you think Western science has been reluctant to take traditional knowledge in a serious sense?
Well, I can tell you my own story, which is that I'm a conventional Western trained scientist, and my first encounter with traditional knowledge was when I moved to the Pacific Islands in the 1980s. And my first reaction was, traditional knowledge is nonsense. There's nothing in there that can possibly compete with Western science. And it probably took me 5 to 8 years to actually start to question that view. So I think Western trained scientists of whatever specialism they are, they tend to privilege their own type of knowledge over all other types of knowledge. And I've seen this myself. I go periodically to geological conferences, and I stand up and I talk about information obtained from traditional stories and things like that. And most of the people are actually very interested, but there's always a handful that sort of raise their eyes to the sky and think, oh, what's this idiot talking about? The only real science is Western science,
Yeah.
and the real solutions come from, Western scientific understandings. So I think it's very disappointing, in a way. But I think the other side is also quite disappointing. So there's a lot of people in Australia, in particular, but I guess in other parts of the world, who place what I consider to be undue emphasis on the value of traditional knowledge. Yes, it worked in the past. Yes, it's hugely impressive. But I don't think any traditional knowledge systems ever had to cope with climate changing at the rate that it's changing now. So, and I think this is very important, because what I'm saying is Western science doesn't have all the answers, but traditional knowledge doesn't have all the answers either. And that if we are to find, excuse me, a sustainable way forward, we need to combine the best of both, rather than saying one has the answer or the other has the answer, because that's a partisan view. It's not a very helpful view in practical terms.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's important to for the general public, and not just in this aspect, but just to be more educated in general, because there's always things that you can learn from one side, and there's always things that you can learn from the other side. And, it's always good to combine those things to create something better than you had before. I think that's really important in today's society.
I agree, and just the openness to that. I think it's just to sort of think, well, what can this teach me? Okay, rather than to say I have all the answers. Rather than say that, I think you just sort of look around and you think, well, does the way these people live, does that have something to teach me? Does it have something to teach the place where I live? Are there lessons in this? We are being confronted at the moment by a sort of situation that we have never been confronted by before, at least not for several thousand years, in terms of the rate at which temperatures are rising and the rate at which sea level is rising. So we can't just depend on recently developed knowledge to map the way forwards. We need to, I think, open our minds a bit more than that. Oh, look, I think in some places it is. No question about it. I think in other places, perhaps less so. It's very difficult to generalize, Alex. I wouldn't like to sort of say, one or the other. I have a lot of students, research students from the Pacific Islands, and as you would expect, they're very passionate about the traditional knowledge that they have learned and that they are learning about. But I also say to them, it's not the whole story. It's not the sole solution. Okay, you also need, as a Pacific Islander, to learn from Western science, just as Western scientists should not be, in my view, so arrogant as to say there's nothing else we can learn from any other knowledge system, because to my mind, there are dozens and dozens of examples of valid knowledge being encoded in so-called myths and legends that can help us to understand the past, but also to help us map the future.
And, is there evidence of this collaboration between modern science and traditional knowledge working together? Like, is there evidence of that working nowadays?
I think we're on the cusp, to be honest. I think we're on the cusp. I think a lot of aid agencies are very sympathetic to the idea of traditional knowledge, but they don't really understand how to incorporate it into their strategies. In the Pacific Islands, we talk a lot about community empowerment these days, and actually giving communities the information that they need to help them, map a way forward that is sustainable for their community. And that involves Western knowledge, particularly in the form of climate change predictions. Okay, how much hotter will this place be in 10 years' time? How much higher will the sea level be in 10 years' time? Okay, that's really important information. But it also requires traditional knowledge. Where did our forefathers live? Where did they get their water from? What sort of foods did they use that we don't necessarily use today? So I think community empowerment requires both types of knowledge. And I think probably more generally, over the next 10 years, we're going to see a lot more traditional knowledge being used in mainstream solutions for sustainability, particularly in the face of climate change.
So, if these aid agencies want to incorporate this sort of traditional knowledge, how in their way of helping, how do you think they should go about it?
Like the example that I gave you earlier about the marine ecologists, I think those marine ecologists should have put their assumptions aside, maybe put their arrogance aside, and gone into the community and asked questions. And that's what I tell all my students, particularly the research students I have from Australia and elsewhere. I say, you go into a community, you ask questions and you listen, okay? And don't do anything for 2 days except listen, okay? Because that's the way to inform yourself. But a lot of external agencies working in the Pacific, there's a language barrier or there's all sorts of cultural barriers. And to be honest, Alex, it gets me a bit annoyed these days. I talk to people from these agencies and they say, we would help the Pacific Islands much more, but there's a language barrier. These people don't understand English very well. And I say to them, well, why should they understand English? Maybe their complaint is that you don't understand their language very well. Who sets the rules of engagement in this kind of thing? And the other big one that I touched on before is spirituality. 99.9% of people living in the Pacific Islands are spiritually engaged. And, They attend a religious service, often more than once a week. Their worldview is one that is largely spiritually grounded rather than scientifically grounded. So if you go into a Pacific Islands community and you start talking about science, and if you don't talk about God, then chances are people won't pay much attention to you. So I've worked with some of the churches in the Pacific Island countries in the past to try and develop, I suppose, agendas around adapting to climate change that resonate with people's spiritual beliefs. And I often say to my students, it's like it's like you going into anywhere in the world and saying, what you people believe is wrong, and what I believe is right, and what I believe is this, and you all have to listen to me and believe it. And no one's going to pay any attention to you, okay? So it's a question, not just of sort of cultural sensitivity, but also a sort of cultural humility. The whole idea of actually listening and accepting other people's knowledge and worldviews as something you can live with, something you're interested in, rather than something you denigrate. Sorry, bit of a soapbox there.
No, you're fine. And you said they're like spiritually what was it active, spiritually active?
Engaged, yeah.
Yeah, spiritually engaged.
Yeah.
And what is this, like their local religion, or is it like?
Well, that's a generalization. I think
Mm-hmm.
most of the people that I'm talking about would be Christian, but a lot of that Christianity is very Pacific in its nature. And certainly in, the early part of the 20th century, a lot of that early Christianity was very much informed by people's traditional spiritual beliefs. And even today, you walk around the landscape in some Pacific islands and people will tell you the traditions associated with particular places. We're climbing up the shins of the god, and down there are his feet, and up there is his head, and sometimes he moves and he does this, and he got here by doing this. So there are sort of layers upon layers, if you like, and the outermost layer is usually Christian, but beneath the surface there are, of course, other belief systems that are still current.
And you talked about when these aid agencies go and try to help these communities there, and you mentioned like one of your suggestions would be to sort of incorporate the local religion inside their solutions. I'm trying to understand how exactly like that would work.
No, I wouldn't say the local religions. So there's a group in the Pacific called the Pacific Conference of Churches, and they're basically an ecumenical Christian organization. Very, very effective. They have a climate change officer, and we have worked with that group in the past to develop messages that can be delivered through Sunday sermons or Sabbath sermons that explain why God expects you to adapt to climate change, why this is happening. And I think it's so important because we're not trying to trick people or fool people. We're trying to help people survive the effects of future climate change. And I don't think you can do that very effectively just by, sitting on your hands and, either waiting for money or waiting for God to come and help you. I think helping yourself is the most effective way forwards.
I see. And what gives you hope, like in the future, when we think about these Pacific Island communities?
Look, I think if you talk to a lot of aid agencies and you read a lot of sort of international reports, you read all about vulnerability and helplessness and the need to build resilience. I think that's all nonsense. These are some of the most resilient people on Earth. They have survived on islands in the middle of the ocean for thousands of years, thousands of kilometers from the nearest continent, and they have survived there. how did they do that if it wasn't because they evolved a way of becoming resilient, and they evolved traditional knowledge that allowed them to sustain themselves in, very tough locations. Of course, they have bundles and bundles of resilience. So I think it's a really cheap shot to label these people as vulnerable and helpless. I really do. I think what aid agencies should be doing, and they are starting to do this, I think more than they did once, is starting to learn more about traditional resilience in the Pacific and how that can be harnessed to help Pacific Island communities towards a sustainable future.
I see. And that's a great statement. And do you have any last words for our listeners today?
Humanity our species has been on Earth for around 250,000 years. We have survived a lot of climate changes in the past. Another area of research of mine is looking at how people survived the rise of sea level after the end of the last great ice age, from about 15,000 years ago to about 6,000 years ago. And this was about 400 feet, over 120 meters of sea level rise. And they survived. It wasn't easy, you can bet. They had to adapt in ways that would have made them uncomfortable, but survive they did. Because if they didn't survive, we wouldn't be here today. So I think a very important message for people, whether they live in the Pacific Islands or wherever in the world they live, is that climate change is going to be extremely difficult to adapt to. And adaptation is not going to look the same everywhere. But we can adapt to it as a species. And I have no doubt that we will come out the other side intact. But don't trivialize the degree of adaptation that we will all have to do.
Well, Dr. Nunn, thank you so much today for joining me on H2O and Beyond. It was a pleasure having you as a guest.
Real pleasure to talk to you, Alex. Thank you so much.
Well, listeners, if you found this episode helpful, please share it with your coworkers and friends. If you want to be a guest on the podcast or have any episode suggestions, I'll link a Google form in the description for that as well. If you want to learn more, I'll also link Dr. Nunn's website as well. He has a lot of great articles and resources for you to learn more. And as always, check out our link tree in our description to stay connected with the H2O and Beyond socials. I'm Alex. Thank you for listening to H2O and Beyond. Stay curious and stay hydrated.